Hello, friends, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. I'm really glad you found your way here tonight. No matter where you are in the world, this peaceful space was made specially for you, a gentle corner where calm science stories can carry you softly towards sleep. Tonight, we're quietly drifting into one of the most haunting chapters in Earth's history, a single day when everything changed. Long before humans walked the earth, before cities, before language, even before the first flowers bloomed, the world belonged to giants. Dinosaurs ruled every corner of land, sea, and sky. For more than 160 million years, they thrived. And then, in a single day, it ended. A 6 mile wide asteroid tore through the atmosphere faster than a bullet, unleashing the force of over 1 billion nuclear bombs. When it struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, paradise was destroyed in an instant. We've all heard that story, but here's the question most stories don't answer: what happened after? Not just in the fiery instant, but in the hours and days that followed. If almost everything died, how did life begin again? Scientists search for answers in a razor-thin band of rock called the KPG boundary, a global layer of iridium-rich clay left behind by the asteroid itself. It marks the exact moment Earth reset, a scar in stone, silent but undeniable, telling us where one world ended and another began. Before we go further, if this little journey is already soothing your thoughts, it would mean so much if you gently tapped the like button, or maybe subscribed if you'd like more sleepy science stories like this one. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know, where are you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there? It's always wonderful to see how far this quiet corner of science travels. So now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, let your mind grow still, and together, let's step into the days after the dinosaurs and watch the world begin again. The final day of the dinosaurs began like any other, across the ancient landscape of what is now Mexico. The morning sun warmed a lush world filled with the calls of creatures that had ruled the earth for millions of years. Giant reptiles wandered the forests, small mammals scurried in the undergrowth, and birds traced patterns through the open skies. To those living in that moment, it must have seemed like a world that would last forever. But far above them, beyond their sight and beyond their understanding, death was already on its way. A vast rock, 6 miles across, had been traveling through the void of space for untold ages. It had no warning lights, no trail of sound, only a silent descent toward its target. It struck the Yucatan Peninsula with unimaginable force. In that single instant, more energy was released than 1 billion nuclear weapons combined. The ground itself opened and swallowed the asteroid, leaving behind a scar almost 100 miles wide, known today as the Chicxulub crater. Mountains of stone were thrown into the sky, vaporized in the heat of the explosion. Entire forests vanished instantly, replaced by a boiling wall of fire and smoke. The animals that lived near the point of impact never had a chance to even register what was happening. Within seconds, shock waves tore through their bodies, flattening everything in their path. The sea nearby rose up into titanic waves, tossing great marine creatures into chaos. All across the continent, the sound must have been deafening, louder than any thunderstorm, a rolling roar that shook the very bones of the earth. Yet the destruction was not confined to the crater itself. The real terror came from what followed. Huge pieces of burning rock were hurled far into the sky, some reaching the very edge of the atmosphere before falling back down. As they rained across the globe, they carried with them fire. When these fragments struck the ground, they ignited forests thousands of miles away. Firestorms spread with unstoppable speed, consuming grasslands and jungles alike. The air grew thick with smoke and ash, For dinosaurs caught in these infernos, escape was almost impossible. Herds of herbivores ran blindly through the haze, their massive bodies crashing into one another as they searched for safety that did not exist. Predators, too, were thrown into confusion. Tyrannosaurs, once kings of their domain, found themselves surrounded by fire and falling debris. Many died instantly, struck by burning rock or overcome by heat. Others lingered, staggering through the smoke as the world around them collapsed. Smaller dinosaurs fled into river valleys or lowlands, only to face the rising waters as tsunamis surged inland, drowning everything in their path. Those who were not killed by fire or flood were left to endure a suffocating darkness. The sky was filled with a choking mix of dust and vapor, so thick that daylight was dimmed to twilight. Ash fell like black snow, coating leaves, bodies, and broken landscapes. Dinosaurs wandered through this nightmare, confused and terrified. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others from smoke inhalation. Even the strongest could not fight against the scale of destruction that had been unleashed. In every corner of the continent, life was caught in chaos. Great sauropods that had once towered above the trees fell to the ground, their immense bodies scorched and broken, raptors scattered, their keen senses overwhelmed by the stench of burning and the roar of collapsing forests. Flying reptiles, blinded by smoke, tumbled from the sky, their wings singed by the heat. Those that survived the first strike were not spared for long. The fires consumed their food, the waters swallowed their nesting grounds, and the very air they breathed carried death. This was the last day of the dinosaurs as rulers of the earth. It was not a single moment, but a chain of disasters unfolding one after the other, each more terrifying than the last. The impact itself had been the spark, but the fires, the tsunamis, and the storm of debris turned that spark into a world-ending blaze. For many dinosaurs, death came swiftly, in fire or flood. For others, it was slower, as they stumbled through a smoke-filled landscape with no food, no shelter, and no hope. And yet, even as the giants fell, the story of Earth was not over. The chaos of that day did not mark the end of life, only a brutal turning point. What followed in the hours after impact would carry the planet into an even darker chapter, one where survival itself became the rarest resource of all. In the hours after the asteroid struck, the Earth trembled as though it had been split apart. The ocean near the Yucatan Peninsula, where the impact tore into the planet, lifted upward in a wall of water taller than city towers. That wall raced outward in every direction, a tsunami of unimaginable size and power. Waves hundreds of feet high rolled across the seas, devouring coastlines as they crashed ashore. The force was so great that entire stretches of shoreline were erased in minutes. Forests that had stood for centuries were ripped out at the roots and carried away like driftwood. Animals unlucky enough to be near the water were swallowed instantly, their bodies swept far into the churning depths. But the devastation was not limited to the seas. The very bones of the earth shuddered. The impact unleashed shock waves that tore through rock and soil, carrying destruction thousands of miles away. Forests were flattened as if they had been pushed down by a giant's hand. Trees splintered and fell in tangled heaps, crushing everything that lived beneath them. Dinosaurs that had survived the first blast staggered under the force, their calls of confusion drowned out by the rumble of the earth itself. The land did not merely shake, it groaned and roared as mountains shivered and rivers changed their course. The air itself was transformed. In the moments after the strike, a torrent of molten rock and dust had been flung into the sky, hurled so high that it reached the edge of space. Slowly, it began to fall back down, first as glowing fragments, raining like meteors across continents, then as ash, fine as powder, drifting outward on the wind. Within hours, the skies that had once been blue began to fade. A dim haze stretched across the horizon, soft at first, but growing heavier with every passing moment. For the creatures still alive, the world grew unrecognizable. Light dimmed as if twilight had arrived far too soon. The sun, once a blazing force of warmth, was now veiled behind a veil of dust. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the ground. The heat of the fires still burning on the surface clashed with the sudden loss of sunlight, creating turbulence in the air. The smell of smoke thickened, carried for hundreds of miles, mixing with the acrid bite of vaporized rock. Each breath was harsh, filled with particles that stung lungs and eyes alike. The tsunamis continued their march, not as a single wave, but as a relentless series. One after another, they swept across oceans, each rebound carrying devastation deeper inland. Low-lying areas were drowned entirely, leaving nothing but a vast inland sea, where once there had been meadows and forests. Dinosaurs that had sought refuge on high ground watched helplessly as the waters surged below them, carrying with it trees, carcasses, and the broken remains of entire ecosystems. Meanwhile, the shock waves were not confined to the surface. They traveled deep into the Earth's crust, triggering landslides and earthquakes across distant regions. Volcanoes far from the impact site stirred, some erupting immediately, others waiting for weeks to add their fury to the chaos. The planet was unsettled, restless, as though the impact had awakened something ancient beneath the ground. Above, the ash continued to climb. It rose higher and higher, carried into the upper atmosphere by the heat of the fires that still raged across the continents. There it spread like a blanket, stretching across the globe. In some places, the sky glowed red as the sun struggled to pierce the haze. In others, darkness already descended, heavy and unnatural, like a storm that would never lift. Tiny fragments of glassy minerals formed in the blast glittered as they fell, burning streaks across the sky before vanishing into the growing night. Life stumbled on through those first terrible hours, but everything had changed. Herds that once grazed peacefully now wandered through smoke-filled valleys. Predators that once stalked with confidence now staggered through a landscape of fire and flood. The cries of the animals, desperate and confused, echoed across a world that was collapsing. The sound of waves crashing, forests splintering, and ash hissing as it fell on burning ground filled the air. There was no silence, only the chaos of a planet struggling under the weight of catastrophe. And still, the skies darkened. Ash and soot did not merely block the sun for moments, they climbed so high that they would linger. In those hours, the first hints of a long night had already begun. What had started as a fiery explosion was now turning into something quieter, but even more deadly. The earth was stepping into a shadow that would not lift for years, a darkness born from fire and ash, a darkness that would test every form of life that remained. As the hours stretched into the first night after impact, the earth itself seemed to be burning. The fragments of molten rock that had been blasted into the sky rained back down across the globe. Each fragment carried fire. When they struck the ground, they set forests and plains ablaze, and in every direction flames began to spread. Soon entire continents were glowing with fire. From above, the planet would not have looked green and blue as it had for millions of years, but red and black, a world lit not by the sun, but by the burning of its own surface. The flames fed on the dense vegetation that had flourished for ages under the warm Mesozoic climate. Ferns, conifers, and towering cycads became fuel for infernos that raced across landscapes faster than herds of dinosaurs could outrun them. Fire leapt from treetop to treetop, and winds created by the rising heat turned the blazes into storms of flame. Animals that had survived the first impact and the rising seas were trapped again, their cries lost in the roar of forests consumed. Ash swirled through the air, carried on smoke that rose in dark spirals toward the heavens. The fires did not burn only on land. Even shallow seas near the coasts boiled with floating mats of vegetation that caught fire, sending plumes of smoke rolling over the waves. River valleys glowed at night with walls of flame on either side. This was not a single wildfire, or even a cluster of them. This was the whole Earth turned into a firestorm planet, a living world in the process of burning itself away. As the fires grew, they poured gases into the atmosphere. Sulfur released from shattered rocks mixed with the smoke, creating a poisonous haze. With each passing hour, the air grew heavier and harder to breathe. Ash particles, fine as dust, drifted on the winds and filled every lung. The sun that had once warmed the dinosaurs and allowed the forests to flourish was hidden behind a veil of soot and gas. Even in places far from the impact, where the ground itself had not shaken, the sky above was darkened by clouds that seemed to have no end. The shift was immediate and merciless. Temperatures, once steady and warm, began to fall as sunlight vanished. Daylight dimmed to twilight, then to something even darker, a world lit only by the flicker of fire on the horizon. The warmth of the sun was gone, and in its place came a chill that seeped into the soil, into the seas, into the bodies of creatures still alive. The air that had once carried the sense of vegetation and the sounds of life was now thick with smoke and silence, broken only by the collapse of burning trees. Herds of dinosaurs stumbled through this altered world, their eyes wide with confusion. Herbivores that had once grazed under clear skies now wandered through a landscape where every plant was charred and every leaf covered in ash. Carnivores that had once hunted with precision struggled to breathe, their lungs filled with grit, their roars muted by the haze. Even creatures that could take to the air found no escape, for the sky was choked with clouds so thick that wings faltered and birds fell. The night that followed was no ordinary night. It was darker than any that had come before. The stars, usually scattered across the heavens, were hidden behind the curtain of soot. The moon, if it could be seen at all, was nothing more than a faint glow through a suffocating sky. For those creatures still clinging to life, there was no distinction between day and night anymore, only a dim and endless dusk. The oceans, too, were changing. The ash and gases that filled the skies began to settle into the seas, turning waters more acidic with each passing hour. The cooling air above clashed with the heat trapped in the ocean surface, creating violent storms. Rain fell not as clean water, but as droplets laced with chemicals, burning leaves, poisoning rivers, and searing the skin of creatures caught beneath it. The very act of breathing, of drinking, of feeding became dangerous, and yet the planet did not stop shifting. With each gust of wind, more ash was carried higher into the atmosphere, climbing layer upon layer until it reached the uppermost edges of the sky. There it spread into a shroud that wrapped itself around the globe. Sunlight, once abundant and life-giving, was now a faint memory. In its place lingered cold, darkness, and the suffocating presence of smoke. The age of dinosaurs was entering a deeper shadow, a shadow that would last not for hours or days, but for years. As firestorms raged across the continents and the skies turned dark with ash, the great rulers of the land stumbled toward their end. Yet, hidden away from the chaos above, life clung stubbornly to the edges of survival. It was not the towering giants with teeth like daggers or the herds that shook the ground who endured. It was the small and the overlooked, the creatures whose strength was not size or power, but patience and concealment. Beneath the scorched surface, in the soil where the heat of flames was softened and the air carried fewer poisons, mammals huddled in their burrows. These were not the great mammals that would one day roam the earth. They were small, no larger than a rat, with sharp senses and cautious natures. In their tunnels, they pressed against one another, their bodies trembling as the ground shook and the air outside filled with smoke. While the dinosaurs above struggled in the open, these creatures found safety in the earth itself. Their hidden homes gave them what the surface could not: shelter from fire, cover from falling debris, and a place to wait out the violence that ruled the world above. The underground was a refuge, but also a prison. Food was scarce, and the air grew heavy with dust even in these dark tunnels. Yet these mammals were adaptable. Many could eat anything they found, from seeds to insects to the decaying remains of other animals. Their ability to survive on scraps allowed them to endure when the grand feasts of the herbivores and predators vanished. Their small size, once a disadvantage against larger hunters, now became their greatest gift. They needed little food, little space, and could hide in places no predator could reach. While the mammals clung to life in the soil, the waters too became sanctuaries. Crocodiles slid silently beneath the surface of rivers and swamps, their armored bodies moving with ancient calm. They had survived countless changes before, from shifting climates to vanishing seas, and now they settled into the water once again. Above the surface, fires raged and forests collapsed, but beneath the water's skin there was shelter. Heat did not spread as fast in the depths, and food could still be found in the murky currents. Fish, carrion, and anything that drifted their way became sustenance. These reptiles could slow their bodies, using little energy, waiting in silence for the chaos above to pass. Turtles, too, withdrew into the water, their shells shielding them from flying debris and heat. They buried themselves in mud or slipped into lakes and ponds where the smoke above was dimmed and dulled. In these shallow refuges, they endured, carrying within them a lineage that would stretch across millions of years. To an outside eye, they may have looked fragile, but their patience was their power. Where swiftness and ferocity failed the great hunters of the age, stillness and endurance allowed these shelled survivors to persist. Even smaller lives endured in places invisible to the eye of giants. Insects buzzed in the smoky haze, clinging to what little vegetation remained. Worms twisted deeper into the soil, safe from flame and ash. They fed on decaying matter, on the bodies of trees and animals, now reduced to fragments. To them, destruction was food. They did not need sunlight, for their world had always been dark. They did not need abundance, for they thrived on death itself. As the forests burned and the skies collapsed into shadow, these creatures multiplied quietly, preparing the ground for the return of life. The world above was filled with silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the crash of waves, but below the soil, within the waters, and hidden in rotting wood, life whispered its refusal to vanish. These were not majestic survivors, they were not rulers, nor were they beautiful in the way the dinosaurs had been, but they were resilient. They endured heat, hunger, darkness, and despair, not by strength but by persistence. In those first terrible hours and days, survival was not measured in dominance, but in the ability to bend and not break. The mammals that clung to their burrows, the crocodiles that glided through blackened rivers, the turtles that buried themselves in quiet ponds, and the insects and worms that thrived in decay, carried within them the fragile spark of the future. Hidden in shadows, surrounded by death, these small and patient creatures kept alive the faintest thread of possibility. And above them, the ash continued to climb into the heavens, darkening the world even further, preparing to plunge the planet into a long and merciless night. As the fires dimmed and the last embers smoldered in the ruins of forests, the skies above remained thick and black. The fine ash and dust thrown into the atmosphere had not settled. Instead, it spread outward until the entire planet was wrapped in a heavy cloak of shadow. The sun, once the constant pulse of warmth and light that fed every living thing, was hidden behind a curtain of soot. Days no longer looked like days. Even at noon, the sky glowed only faintly, as if twilight had been stretched across the earth without end. Without sunlight, the world began to cool. At first, the change was subtle, the heat of the fires still clinging to the air, but as the days turned to weeks, temperatures dropped further and further. Winds carried the chill across continents, and the earth began to freeze. What had once been a lush, warm planet, filled with tropical forests and wetlands, now turned into a cold, dim world that felt more like endless winter. Rivers that once flowed freely became crusted with ice, and lakes stiffened into silence beneath the dark sky. The plants were the first to suffer. Without the energy of sunlight, photosynthesis collapsed, leaves withered and fell, and forests that had survived the fires now starved in the gloom. Grasslands browned, ferns shriveled, and the seeds that had always waited patiently for spring no longer had the warmth they needed to grow. The Earth's vast blanket of green, which had stretched across continents for millions of years, faded into gray. With the collapse of plants came the unraveling of food chains. Herbivores, those massive creatures that once grazed endlessly, were left with nothing to eat. The survivors of the fires and floods now wandered across barren landscapes where every stem and leaf had vanished. Their heavy bodies grew weaker with each passing day, and one by one they fell, their great skeletons collapsing into the dust. Smaller plant-eating animals fared no better. Whether bird or reptile, insect or mammal, those who relied on greenery soon found only emptiness where life once thrived. The predators followed in their wake. The mighty carnivores that had ruled the land with sharp teeth and cunning eyes now found no prey to hunt. The roars of creatures like Tyrannosaurus rex, which once echoed across valleys, grew fewer and weaker. Hunger gnawed at them, and even the strongest could not outlast the silence of empty plains. Some scavenged the carcasses left behind, but the supply dwindled quickly, and decay set in before the starving beasts could reach it. The seas, too, became barren. The plankton that formed the base of the ocean's food web collapsed without sunlight, and the ripple of starvation spread outward. Fish populations dropped, marine reptiles perished, and the oceans grew quieter with each passing week. Across the globe, life became a struggle for even the smallest act of survival. Insects that had once thrived on vegetation now turned to decay. Mammals, still hidden in burrows, clung to scraps of food and the warmth of their huddled bodies. Birds searched desperately for seeds or insects, their wings carrying them across vast empty skies where no sound of life answered their calls. The earth was not only dark, it was silent. The calls of dinosaurs, the rustle of great herds, the splashes of giant reptiles in the sea, all faded into nothingness. In their place was the howl of cold winds moving through skeletal forests, the hiss of ash falling from the sky, and the groan of ice as it spread into places it had never reached before. For months, this frozen silence continued. Each passing day without sunlight deepened the chill. The air grew sharper, biting into skin, numbing movement. The soil froze, rivers stiffened, and the oceans themselves began to cool, layer by layer. It was as if the earth had been locked away in a long, merciless night. Yet even as the world staggered under this nuclear winter, tiny sparks of survival remained. They were fragile, hidden, and often unseen. The darkness did not erase all life, but it tested every living thing with the harshest question: endure or vanish forever. And with the sun still hidden behind its thick shroud, the trial of survival was only just beginning. Beneath the darkened skies, The oceans, too, were transforming. The asteroid strike had not only torn open the land, it had also unleashed gases and minerals that changed the very chemistry of the air. When the fires and the shattered rocks released sulfur and nitrogen into the sky, those particles mixed with moisture in the clouds. The rains that followed were not the gentle waters that once fed rivers and nourished forests. They were laced with acid, and when they fell back to earth, they scorched everything they touched. On land, this rain stripped leaves from the few plants that had survived the fires. In the seas, it created a deadly brew that poisoned shallow waters and coastal zones. Once clear lagoons became cauldrons of acid where fish gasped and corals withered. Shells of small marine animals began to dissolve, their protective walls no match for the corrosive waters. What had been nurseries for life became silent graveyards, their surfaces littered with the remains of creatures that could not withstand the chemical assault. The poison reached into the smallest corners of the marine world. Tiny plankton, so small that they were invisible to the eye, had long formed the base of the ocean's food chain. They captured sunlight, turned it into energy, and fed countless other creatures. But now, with the skies dimmed and the waters poisoned, their populations collapsed. Without sunlight to power their growth and without stable waters to live in, plankton dwindled to almost nothing. The collapse rippled outward like falling dominoes. With the plankton gone, small fish starved. With the small fish gone, larger predators were left adrift in seas where every hunt ended in emptiness. The great marine reptiles that had once ruled the oceans found themselves in a world that no longer sustained them. Mosasaurs, enormous hunters with jaws lined in teeth, had once prowled the deep, chasing schools of fish and ammonites. Now they swam through silent waters, their bodies wasting as prey became scarcer each day. They were creatures built for abundance, for seas overflowing with food. In this new world of scarcity, their strength and size became their weakness. The oceans that had fed them for millions of years no longer held enough to keep them alive. One by one, they vanished, their line ending in the silence of the poisoned seas. Ammonites, too, the coiled shelled relatives of squid, were lost forever. They had survived earlier extinctions, filling the seas with their spiraled shells and drifting in countless numbers. They had been both predators and prey, an essential thread in the web of ocean life. But with plankton collapsing and the waters turning acidic, their shells could not endure. They dissolved in the changing seas, and their young, once scattered across the waves in vast swarms, found no future. The last of the ammonites disappeared, leaving only their fossils to whisper their existence to those who would come millions of years later. Even creatures far from the coasts felt the change. Sharks and other fish, though more resilient than some, faced dwindling food supplies. Their movements grew frantic as they searched for what little life remained. The deep ocean, though shielded from some of the chemical chaos, was not safe either. The steady rain of nutrients from above, once fed by plankton and surface life, slowed to a trickle. Darkness and hunger pressed down into the depths, and the deep became even more silent. The oceans, which had once been full of sound and movement, now felt eerily still. Where schools of fish had flashed like silver ribbons, there was only empty water. Where ammonites had drifted in their spiraled shells, there was only silence. Where great reptiles had surged with power, there were only shadows gliding toward extinction. Above the seas, ash still fell from the sky, and acid rain continued to seep into the waters. The surface boiled with chemical change, and the life that had endured there for eons dwindled further. The earth was not just losing its giants on land, it was losing entire chapters of its marine story, entire dynasties of creatures that had thrived since long before the first dinosaurs had ever taken their steps on land. And as the waters grew quieter, the sky above remained heavy with the same veil of ash that had begun it all. The silence of the seas joined the silence of the land, pulling the planet deeper into its long night of extinction. The world that had once glowed with vibrant green forests and sunlit oceans now fell under a shadow that refused to lift. The ash and soot hurled into the sky by the asteroid strike spread higher and higher until it wrapped the planet like a suffocating shroud. What began as a haze soon thickened into a blanket that smothered the skies. Days passed, but the sun did not return. Its warmth, once steady and reliable, was swallowed behind the veil. At first, the world dimmed into a kind of endless twilight. Noon felt like dusk, and shadows stretched unnaturally long. But as the days became weeks, the light faded even more. The sun's rays, struggling to pierce the dense clouds of dust and smoke, grew weaker until they could barely be seen at all. It was not simply darkness, it was a heavy, oppressive absence, a ceiling of shadow that pressed down over the entire earth. For months, and perhaps for years, sunlight was a memory. Without the sun, warmth drained away. Temperatures that had once supported lush vegetation and teeming ecosystems plummeted. The earth cooled at a frightening pace. Winds carried the chill across the continents, spreading it even to places that had once been tropical. Rivers stiffened into ice, wetlands froze into stillness. Even the air itself seemed sharper, biting at the lungs of anything that breathed it. The world was entering a cold that many creatures had never known, and for the great reptiles that had flourished in warmth for millions of years, the freeze was merciless. The silence that spread across the earth was as profound as the darkness. Herds that once thundered across plains were gone. Forests that had swayed with the calls of birds and the buzzing of insects now stood lifeless, their branches brittle and blackened. Along the coasts, the once constant rhythm of marine life faded into quiet as food webs unraveled. The calls of predators, the crashes of herds, the chatter of countless smaller creatures, all disappeared. In their place came the moan of wind through barren landscapes and the groan of ice as it spread into regions that had never before known its grip. For the survivors, this new world was cruel beyond measure. The mammals that huddled in burrows could no longer emerge to find even the scraps of plants or insects they once depended on. Birds that had managed to endure the fires now searched the skies in vain for warmth or food. Reptiles, once lords of both land and water, struggled to move in the freezing air. The cold drained strength from every body, slowing hearts, numbing limbs, and sapping the will to continue. The seas mirrored the land. With sunlight gone, the upper layers of the oceans cooled, and the balance of currents shifted. Waters once alive with movement slowed, and with plankton already decimated, the oceans became deserts of emptiness. Fish swam through gray silence, their numbers dwindling with each passing season. Predators, weakened by hunger, drifted in restless patterns before finally sinking into the deep. Even the surface storms that formed as the atmosphere reeled under its new burden carried a strange stillness. Rain fell in freezing sheets, and snow blanketed regions that had never seen it before. The earth had become a frozen wasteland. Vast stretches of land lay under a veil of ice, and the air carried a bitter chill that clawed at every creature still alive. Darkness stretched from horizon to horizon, so complete that even the stars were hidden behind the thick curtain of ash. The moon was little more than a faint ghostly glow, blurred and distorted by the haze. For creatures that had once lived in rhythm with the rising and setting of the sun, the loss of that light was more than physical. It was a disorientation, a breaking of the natural cycle that had guided life for countless ages. Yet, as the Earth lay under this endless shadow, time pressed forward. The planet turned through its days and nights, though no one could tell the difference anymore. Silence lingered, the cold deepened, and the darkness held. The Earth itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting in the long pause between destruction and whatever would come next. In the dim, ash-filled world that followed the asteroid strike, the giants who had once ruled the Earth faced their final days. For more than 160 million years, dinosaurs had been the masters of the land, dominating every corner of the planet with their size, their strength, and their sheer abundance. They had thrived in warmth, in forests thick with ferns, in plains where vegetation was endless, in an environment that seemed perfectly suited to their massive frames. But in the world left behind by fire and shadow, their very size became a burden too heavy to carry. The great herbivores, creatures as long as houses and as tall as trees, needed vast amounts of food every single day. Their lives had always been tied to the endless supply of greenery that spread across continents. Now, with the skies darkened and plants withered, the herds that had once roamed in power and security began to falter. The ground that had trembled under their weight now shook for the last time as their bodies, weakened by hunger, stumbled and fell. Some starved where they stood, their long necks lowered to barren soil. Others collapsed in exhausted groups, unable to continue their search for food. The predators that depended on these herds were not spared. The tyrannosaurs, once kings of the late Cretaceous, relied on the abundance of prey that had filled their hunting grounds. With herbivores vanishing, the balance tipped swiftly toward famine. These hunters, once fierce and unstoppable, grew gaunt and weak. Their roars, which had once rolled across valleys like thunder, grew hoarse and faint. Some scavenged the remains of dying herds, but the supply of flesh quickly dwindled. Starvation tightened its grip on even the mightiest jaws. Across the landscape, scenes of quiet devastation unfolded. Where once there had been endless movement, herds migrating, predators stalking, nests filled with the calls of young, there was now stillness. Footprints that had once been pressed into the earth with confidence, filled with ash and snow, fading into the gray of the wasted land. The echoes of giant steps, sounds that had carried through forests and across plains, grew softer until they disappeared altogether. The dinosaurs were not defeated in a single moment, as many imagine. Their fall stretched out over weeks, months, and years. One by one, herds collapsed. One by one, lineages ended. Some creatures lingered in small pockets, clinging to survival for as long as they could, but the web that had sustained them was unraveling too quickly. Without plants, there could be no herbivores. Without herbivores, predators could not endure. The giants, built to dominate a world of plenty, could not adapt to a world of scarcity. In their final days, the sight must have been heartbreaking. A massive triceratops, once a proud defender of its herd, stumbling through a silent forest stripped bare. A sauropod, its long neck lowered to the ground, eyes dull with hunger as it searched for a fern that no longer grew. A pack of raptors, lean and desperate, circling carrion that was already gone. These were not the rulers of Earth anymore. They were fading shadows, each step slower, each breath shallower, until the silence closed in around them. The world that once belonged to them grew emptier with each passing season. The familiar sounds of their calls, the vibrations of their movements, the constant presence of their enormous bodies, all disappeared. In their place came winds carrying ash, the creak of dead trees, and the distant crash of seas reshaped by storms. Where life had once flourished in overwhelming abundance, there was now a haunting quiet. And still, hidden in the soil, in burrows, in the waters, smaller creatures endured. But for the giants, the age that had stretched across millions of years ended in silence. The echo of their footsteps faded, not with one final roar or one final battle, but with the soft surrender of hunger and cold. The rulers of earth had fallen, and their absence left behind an emptiness that would never be filled in the same way again. As the last of the giants faltered and their footsteps faded into silence, the earth did not fall completely still. Beneath the ash and the cold, life whispered on. It did not roar, it did not thunder, it did not tower above the land as the dinosaurs once had. Instead, it crept and fluttered and burrowed. It survived in the smallest of forms, in creatures so unremarkable that for millions of years they had lived in the shadows of giants. Now, in the quiet of a ruined world, those shadows were gone, and the smallest lives began to shape the future. The mammals that had hidden in the earth, tucked inside narrow burrows, stepped cautiously into the dim and frozen air. They were tiny compared to the fallen rulers, no larger than rats or rabbits. Yet their very smallness had saved them. Where the giants needed endless fields of plants to feed their massive bodies, these little survivors could endure on scraps. Seeds, roots, insects, and even the remains of the dead became food enough to carry them forward. Their sharp teeth, quick movements, and simple but flexible diets gave them an advantage in a world where abundance had turned to scarcity. They scurried through the ruins of forests, weaving between the bones of creatures that once would have trampled them without notice. They sniffed at the ash-covered ground, searching for anything edible. They carried seeds in their pouches and bellies, scattering them as they traveled, unknowingly preparing the way for plants to take root again one day. Their bodies warmed one another in small groups, and their sharp instincts helped them find shelter where few others could. They were not majestic, but they were relentless. Above the ground, a different kind of survivor still beat its wings against the heavy skies. The birds, descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, were the only members of that once mighty family to endure. Their gift was not size or strength, but adaptability. Some were small and swift, darting through the dim air to hunt insects or forage for seeds. Others clung to sheltered trees, hiding in the branches that had not yet fallen. Their feathers insulated them against the cold. Their mobility allowed them to search wide areas for food, and their ability to eat a variety of things meant that, even in a broken world, they could endure. In a sense, the birds carried with them the last beating heart of the dinosaurs. Though the great reptilian titans were gone, their lineage did not end in silence. In the flutter of wings over ash, in the faint calls carried on winds, a part of the age of dinosaurs lived on, and these winged survivors, fragile as they seemed, would go on to fill the skies that had once echoed with the cries of pterosaurs and giant predators. On the ground and in the soil, the humblest creatures of all began their quiet work. Insects swarmed across carcasses and decaying wood, breaking down what the fires and cold had left behind. Beetles, ants, and countless other tiny bodies fed on death itself, turning it back into soil. Worms dug deeper into the earth, feasting on rot and carrying nutrients downward, where seeds could one day grow. Flies laid their eggs in the remains of fallen giants, and their larvae consumed what was left, cleaning the world in a process as ancient as life itself. It was a cycle without glory, a work done in silence and shadow, but it was essential. While the skies stayed dark and the cold pressed on, these insects and worms ensured that nothing was wasted. They turned death into the possibility of life, fueling the slow rebuilding of ecosystems. What seemed like the smallest lives became the engines of renewal. The inheritance of the small was not immediate triumph, but simple survival. Yet in that survival was the beginning of something extraordinary. The mammals who huddled in burrows would one day give rise to vast new lineages. The birds who spread their wings in the dim skies would diversify into countless forms, from songbirds to predators. The insects that fed on decay would continue to weave themselves into the roots of every ecosystem that followed. The giants had ruled with size and power, but their time had ended. In the silence that followed, it was not the strongest who carried life forward. It was the quiet, the hidden, the overlooked. And as the earth lingered in its long night, those small survivors carried the fragile spark of a future no one could have imagined. The first year after the impact was unlike anything Earth had ever endured. What had once been a planet of light and warmth was now locked in a prison of cold and shadow. The ash and soot that had spread across the skies did not fade quickly. It clung to the atmosphere, blotting out the sun, sealing the earth beneath a canopy of darkness. Seasons blurred together, and what might have been spring or summer felt no different from the depths of winter. The air was sharp and bitter, filled with smoke and dust that had not yet settled. Even in places untouched by fire or flood, the land lay frozen. Rivers that had once nourished valleys were capped in ice, and lakes were stiffened into silent plains of glass. The winds carried a chill that seeped into the ground, into the waters, into the bones of every living thing. The earth, which had been vibrant and overflowing with life, now resembled a dying world. The loss of light and warmth continued to claim victims long after the initial strike. Plants, already withered, gave no sign of return. Without them, the chain of life grew weaker each day. Those animals that had survived the first days of fire and falling debris now faced an enemy just as deadly: starvation. Herbivores wandered aimlessly through barren plains, their bellies hollow, their strength fading with every step. Carnivores followed, their eyes gaunt and desperate, searching for prey that no longer existed. The age of abundance had ended, and hunger pressed down upon all. Extinction did not come in a single blow, but in a long and relentless wave. Each week, each month, more species slipped away. Entire lineages that had survived for millions of years vanished in silence, leaving no trace but bones in the ash. The forests that had once echoed with calls and movement now stood still, their branches bare, their soils scattered with remains. In the oceans, where life had once flourished in countless forms, the silence deepened as plankton failed to recover and food webs collapsed. Extinction became the rhythm of the planet, a slow and steady drumbeat of loss. In this new world, scavengers emerged as the last keepers of the old age. With no living prey to hunt and no green plants to graze, they turned to what remained: the bodies of the dead. Across the barren plains, small mammals gnawed at bones and scraps of flesh, their sharp teeth breaking into what they could find. Birds that had endured picked at carcasses, tearing what little meat was left. Insects multiplied in the shadows of decay, swarming over fallen giants, reducing them piece by piece until only skeletons remained. The landscape itself became a graveyard. Enormous skeletons of dinosaurs lay scattered, their ribs arching upward like the remains of ancient ships wrecked on a shore. Skulls the size of boulders rested half buried in ash, tracks pressed into the soil, once signs of movement and dominance, now led nowhere. Over these silent remains, scavengers picked and crawled, their small lives feeding on the last echoes of a vanished world. The first year after the asteroid was marked not by survival in strength, but by endurance in scarcity. Life shrank into hidden corners, into burrows and nests, into muddy riverbeds where warmth and food could still be scraped together. Each day was a test, each night a trial. The earth had become a wasteland of bones, a place where silence pressed against every horizon, where the once mighty giants were reduced to relics, and where the future rested not in dominance, but in persistence. The planet still turned, the winds still moved, but for those who remained alive, time itself felt heavy and endless. Days and months stretched into one long season of cold darkness, and the survivors pressed on, unaware that their quiet endurance was shaping the beginning of a new age. The skies that remained dark with ash did not only hide the sun, they became cauldrons of poison. The asteroid's impact had thrown sulfur, nitrogen, and other chemicals into the atmosphere, and as clouds carried them across the world, they returned to the surface in the form of rain. But this was not the gentle rain that once fed rivers and nourished forests. This rain was sharp, corrosive, filled with acid that burned whatever it touched. Forests that had already been weakened by fire now suffered a new attack from above. Leaves that had managed to hold on turned black and curled as drops of acid ate away at them. Tree bark cracked and peeled, and branches collapsed under the weight of corrosion. Lakes and rivers, once home to fish and amphibians, frothed as the acidic water seeped in, lowering their pH until the delicate balance of life could no longer be sustained. Fish gasped at the surface, their gills burning, as if the very water that had sheltered them had turned to poison. Amphibians, with their thin and sensitive skin, were among the first to perish, their bodies overwhelmed by the toxic rains. On open ground, the soil itself was stripped bare. The acid rain washed away nutrients that plants needed to survive. What had once been fertile fields became lifeless stretches of mud, their richness dissolved and carried away by streams now running with chemical water. Seeds buried in the soil struggled to germinate, and even those that did break through the surface quickly shriveled. The land was no longer a place of growth, but a harsh, bitter landscape where little could take root. The animals that remained had no choice but to adapt or perish. Small mammals that ventured out from their burrows scavenged carefully, avoiding pools of rainwater that could burn their mouths and skin. They learned to gnaw on the softened wood of fallen trees, pulling out insects hidden inside, turning to sources of food they had once ignored. Birds, fragile yet enduring, fluttered across the poisoned land, searching for seeds that had escaped the rain. Their beaks cracked open what little they could find, and their resilience allowed them to adjust to diets far removed from their ancestors' abundance. Insects, once again, found opportunity where others saw only death. Beetles thrived in the rotting trunks, their hard shells protecting them from the harsh droplets. Worms dug deeper, tunneling below the poisoned surface to safer layers of soil where decay still provided sustenance. These small workers of the earth continued to recycle what remained, breaking down corpses, wood, and debris into the beginnings of new soil. Even in landscapes stripped bare, they carried out their silent work, preparing the ground for a distant future where life might return. Yet for many creatures, the poisoned rains were a final cruelty. Reptiles that relied on still waters found their habitats turned into acid traps. The shallow ponds where they once laid eggs became inhospitable, their surfaces scalding and their chemistry lethal. Some crocodiles and turtles endured by hiding in deeper waters, but countless others succumbed as their environments dissolved around them. Each storm brought a fresh wave of destruction, falling not in days of abundance but in months of scarcity, when every loss pushed survivors closer to the edge. The smell of the world itself changed. The air carried the acrid sting of burning forests and sour rain. The soil reeked of decay, mixed with chemical sharpness. The once sweet smell of flowers, grasses, and fruit-bearing plants had been erased, replaced by the odor of a planet wounded to its core. Animals that raised their heads to sniff the wind found no comfort, only the warning of further ruin. In this poisoned land, survival became a matter of ingenuity and endurance. Every creature that managed to persist did so by shrinking its needs, by finding niches untouched by the worst of the rain, or by burrowing deeper into the earth itself. It was not a world for the mighty anymore, but for the resilient and the adaptable, and while the acid rains scoured the surface and stripped the soils bare, the silence above continued. The sun remained hidden behind its veil, the air still heavy with ash. The planet lingered under its shroud, cold, dark, and now toxic, carrying life through yet another trial in its long night of survival. As if the asteroid strike had not been enough to cripple the Earth, the planet itself began to fight against its own survival. In the region that is now India, a chain of volcanoes known as the Deccan Traps had already been active before the impact, but in the years that followed, their eruptions grew fiercer, as though the Earth was releasing its own fury in response to the wound of the collision. Walls of lava spilled across the land, covering valleys, forests, and rivers in glowing rivers of fire. The molten rock did not flow for days or weeks alone. It erupted again and again, in pulses that stretched across thousands of years, layering the land with basalt until the region was buried beneath sheets of stone that, even today, cover an area larger than modern France. The eruptions poured out gases alongside the lava, filling the skies with even more ash and poison at a time when the atmosphere was already choking. Each eruption sent sulfur into the air, mingling with the veil of particles left behind by the asteroid. Acid rains, already burning the forests and lakes, grew harsher still. But it was not only sulfur. With every explosion, carbon dioxide surged upward into the atmosphere in immense volumes, a greenhouse gas that trapped heat. In a world where temperatures had already plummeted under the shadow of ash, the effect of this volcanic carbon dioxide created a cycle of extremes. At first, the darkness had cooled the earth into freezing winters. Now, as the skies slowly began to clear, the buildup of greenhouse gases threatened to swing the climate back toward heat. The earth was trapped between two torments: cold that killed through starvation, and heat that scorched what little life was trying to recover. This oscillation made survival even harder because ecosystems that might have stabilized under one condition were instead pulled back and forth between extremes. Creatures that had adapted to cold were suddenly confronted with warming periods, while plants that tried to regrow were poisoned again by rains or buried under fresh volcanic ash. The cycles of eruption made the world unpredictable, and unpredictability is often as deadly as outright destruction. The Deccan Traps did not erupt in silence. The ground shook for hundreds of miles with every burst of molten fire. Earthquakes fractured landscapes already scarred by the asteroid. New rifts opened, releasing even more gases. The air thickened, heavy with smoke, dust, and chemical vapors. Insects and small animals could suffocate near the vents. Even creatures far from the lava fields felt the effects, as winds carried the volcanic haze across continents. For many years, scientists debated the roles of asteroid and volcano in this catastrophe. Some argued that the asteroid's strike alone was enough to drive the mass extinction, while others pointed to the Deccan eruptions as the final blow that prolonged the collapse of ecosystems. The truth may be that both disasters were intertwined, each magnifying the other. The asteroid had set the stage by throwing the world into chaos, and the volcanoes deepened that chaos, ensuring that recovery would not come quickly. The sheer volume of material released by the Deccan Traps was staggering. Trillions of tons of carbon dioxide may have entered the skies, shifting global temperatures for hundreds of thousands of years. The layers of lava that cooled and hardened formed a staircase-like landscape, vast steps of black stone that stretched to the horizon. Even today, these formations remain silent monuments to one of the most destructive volcanic episodes in Earth's history. For the survivors of the extinction, the eruptions were yet another trial. Small mammals scurried across lands newly covered in basalt, their burrows destroyed and their food sources buried. Birds that had begun to spread into new territories found themselves forced to move again, seeking shelter from poisoned air and unstable climates. Insects, though adaptable, faced the challenge of ash-covered soils and cycles of heat and cold that made their habitats fragile. Each eruption was a reminder that the Earth itself was still reshaping, restless and hostile. The world was not simply enduring the aftermath of a single catastrophe. It was caught in the grip of two forces working together, one from the sky, the asteroid, and one from within, the volcanoes. Together, they reshaped the planet into a harsher, more volatile place, drawing out the extinction into a long age of struggle. And as the lava cooled into stone, and the skies filled with yet another layer of gases, the earth drifted deeper into its uneasy silence, carrying forward only those who could withstand the weight of chaos that seemed to have no end. When the surface of the earth became too harsh for survival, life turned inward. Above ground, the world was locked in cold darkness, poisoned by ash, storms, and acid rains. But beneath the soil, in the hidden chambers and winding tunnels that lay just out of reach of the devastation, a quieter struggle unfolded. Here, in burrows and root systems, in layers of soil that shielded against the worst of the climate, life clung to its last fragile threads. Small mammals, no larger than a rat or rabbit, became masters of survival by retreating underground. Their burrows were more than homes. They were fortresses against the freezing air and shields against the poisoned rains that scoured the land above. In these dark tunnels, they huddled together for warmth, pressing their tiny bodies close to conserve heat. They fed on whatever scraps they could find, stored seeds, the occasional insect, or the remains of plants washed into their burrows. Some dug deeper when the cold seeped in, carving new chambers where the soil still held a faint trace of warmth. In their quiet, hidden lives, these mammals carried the future of an entire class of animals, unaware that millions of years later, their descendants would include us. Reptiles, too, found refuge below the surface. Turtles dug into riverbanks, where the soil insulated them from the worst of the freeze. Lizards crawled deep into crevices, their bodies slowing down into torpor, conserving what little energy remained until the harshest months passed. Crocodiles, ancient survivors of so many previous trials, waited in muddy dens, able to outlast long stretches of famine and cold. Their patience, their ability to endure stillness, gave them the strength to remain when larger, more demanding creatures vanished. It was not only animals that depended on the hidden world beneath the surface. Seeds, buried beneath layers of ash and soil, endured in silence. Above ground, plants had shriveled in the darkness. Forests had burned, meadows had frozen, and nutrient-rich soils had been stripped bare by acid rains. Yet deep within the earth, seeds lay dormant, their protective shells keeping them alive through months and years of trial. They waited in the cold soil, conserving their energy until warmth and light returned. These buried fragments of life became the silent guardians of the future forests that would one day regrow. In the absence of sunlight, another form of life found its moment. Fungi thrived in the darkness. feeding on the decay left behind by fallen trees, dead animals, and layers of ash-soaked organic matter. They spread their unseen networks through the soil. What had once been forests now rotted into rich fodder for their growth. Mushrooms sprouted in the dim, damp corners of ruined landscapes. Underground, tangled webs of mycelium broke down the dead, recycling nutrients into forms that one day would support new life. While the giants had ruled in the light, fungi now ruled in the shadows, turning destruction into a foundation for renewal. Insects, worms, and countless small organisms joined them in this hidden cycle. Worms tunneled through the soil, aerating it and feeding on decayed matter, spreading nutrients into deeper layers. Beetles multiplied, breaking apart wood that had been blackened by fire. Ants carried fragments of food back into underground colonies, living in societies that endured even when the surface was stripped bare. Together with fungi, they became the great recyclers of a dying world, transforming death into the first faint whispers of rebirth. The underground world became a stark contrast to the silence above. While the surface lay frozen and empty, beneath the soil there was movement, warmth, and survival. The Earth's hidden layers became the cradle of persistence, a place where life could shrink itself, endure the trial, and prepare for the chance to emerge again. In these dark shelters, life learned its greatest lesson, that survival did not always belong to the largest or the strongest, but to those who could endure in silence, who could wait patiently in hidden corners, and who could find nourishment in the most unlikely places. And so, while the giants vanished above, the future of life pulsed quietly underground, waiting for the day when light would return. The earth is a web, and every strand of that web depends on another. When one strand breaks, others begin to snap, and soon the whole structure starts to fall apart. After the asteroid, after the fires and the acid rains, that collapse became impossible to stop. It began at the very base of life itself, with the plants that had once covered the earth in endless green. For millions of years, plants had been the first step in every chain of survival. They captured the sun's energy, turned it into food, and fed everything else. Ferns, flowering plants, trees, and grasses formed the foundation for herds of hungry mouths. But now, in the endless dark and poisoned rains, photosynthesis had almost ceased. Plants withered, leaves curled into ash, and forests died where they stood. Without sunlight, nothing new grew. What had once been a flourishing bed of abundance became a silent floor of decay. The herbivores, great and small, felt the collapse first. Creatures that had once grazed in herds now wandered across barren ground, their stomachs hollow, their energy fading. Triceratops, with their broad beaks and armored frills, searched for greenery that no longer grew. Hadrosaurs, once thriving in massive groups, found nothing but ash-covered soil. Sauropods, the giants whose necks stretched like bridges into the canopy, faced starvation in lands where the trees were nothing more than charred skeletons. Their massive bodies, which had been their strength, now demanded more than the land could give. They fell in great numbers, their bones left scattered across the plains, silent monuments to a feast that never returned. With the herbivores starving, the predators soon followed. Carnivores like Tyrannosaurus rex had always thrived on the abundance of prey. They hunted the giants, scavenged carcasses, and dominated with their power. But when the herds fell, the hunters found only emptiness. The kill that once sustained them for days became rare and then vanished altogether. Packs of raptors prowled in desperation, fighting over scraps. Larger predators, needing even more food to survive, could not last. The starvation of herbivores echoed upward into the carnivores, toppling one rung of the chain after another. The collapse was not limited to land. In the oceans, the destruction spread just as quickly. Plankton, the invisible plants of the sea, were devastated by the lack of sunlight. These microscopic organisms fed countless marine creatures, and when they disappeared, the foundation of ocean life collapsed. Marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, once the terrors of the deep, found their hunting grounds barren. Schools of fish dwindled as food ran out, and the giants of the sea followed the path of the dinosaurs on land, vanishing into extinction. Ammonites, the coiled-shelled creatures that had survived for hundreds of millions of years, perished completely, leaving behind only fossils to tell their story. The oceans, once filled with movement and sound, grew quiet. The splashes of marine reptiles breaking the surface, the swirling currents of feeding fish, the constant churn of life, all faded. The waves still rose and fell, but beneath them, silence spread like a shadow. The collapse of food chains was not sudden like the strike of the asteroid. It was slow, drawn out, a cruel unraveling that left the earth emptier with each passing month. Every creature was tied to another, and when the plants failed, everything else followed. The great herds, the fierce predators, the hunters of the seas, all fell together in a cascade of hunger and loss. In the ruins of that collapse, only the small, the adaptable, and the hidden could endure. The world that had once belonged to giants was shrinking, its life compressed into burrows, shadows, and scavengers. Above, the earth remained dark, and below, the cycle of starvation pressed on, pulling one link after another into silence. Even as most of the world's giants fell, the age of dinosaurs did not vanish in a single instant. After the firestorms, after the freezing nights, after the poisoned rains, there were still pockets where a few survivors clung to existence. Isolated valleys, sheltered riverbanks, and regions less directly scarred by the asteroid's first blow may have given some dinosaurs a little more time. Fossil evidence hints at this, suggesting that not every dinosaur perished in the very first waves of destruction. Some lingered, stragglers caught between a past that was ending and a future they could not reach. Imagine a small herd of hadrosaurs moving slowly across a gray and barren plain. Their hides, once sleek and strong, hang loose from starvation. They search for plants that no longer grow, pulling at stems that crumble to dust. Mothers try to shield their young, but their own strength is fading. Each step feels heavier than the last. Somewhere nearby, a lone predator follows, its ribs visible beneath its skin, too weak to chase, but too desperate to stop. Both prey and predator are caught in the same trap, bound by the same hunger that now rules the earth. Other dinosaurs may have survived for a time in regions where fires did not reach as fiercely. A few ceratopsians perhaps found shelter in lowlands where rivers offered patches of green, or small groups of raptors may have stalked weakened prey for a few final hunts. But these brief glimmers of survival could not last. Without a steady supply of plants, the herbivores faded. Without herbivores, the carnivores starved. Every pocket of life eventually closed, one after another, until the silence spread across continents. Fossils provide only fragments of this story, but they whisper of stragglers. Bones found just above the boundary layer of ash suggest that some dinosaurs outlasted their kin by years, maybe even decades, before disappearing entirely. These last survivors lived in a world utterly changed from the one their ancestors had ruled for more than 160 million years. Where there had once been lush forests and endless herds, there was now emptiness. The land echoed not with roars but with the cries of the last, fading voices, The tragedy of these final dinosaurs lies not in their sudden destruction, but in their slow decline. They had survived countless trials before, from climate shifts to volcanic eruptions, from new predators to changing seas. For millions of years, they had adapted and thrived, but this time, the scale of the catastrophe was too great. The world that had nurtured them no longer existed. Their size, once their strength, had become their downfall, demanding more than the land could offer. Picture the last great sauropod, its long neck sweeping across an empty horizon. It pauses, lifting its head as if searching for the green canopy that had once fed it. But the trees are gone, reduced to stumps and ash. Its massive body, built to wander across vast landscapes, now towers over nothing but silence. Its footsteps, once thunderous, are faint echoes in a land where no herd answers back. Even the smaller dinosaurs, agile and clever, could not endure. Without insects or seeds in enough supply, they weakened. Without stable climates to nurture nests, their eggs failed to hatch. The delicate balance of reproduction and survival unraveled. Each year that passed claimed more of them, until the world that had once shaken beneath their presence grew still. And so, within only a few short years, the last non-avian dinosaurs slipped away. Their bones were left in the soil, their imprints pressed into ash that would harden into stone. Above them, the skies remained dim, the air heavy, the land scarred. The giants had roared for millions of years, but in the end, their voices faded not in a single thunderclap, but in a long, aching silence. Yet even as their kind vanished, their lineage did not fully die. In the quiet beating of wings, in the small bodies of birds that endured, a fragment of the dinosaurs lived on. But for the great thunder lizards themselves, the last chapter had closed. Their age had ended, and the earth was left to wait, holding their memory in fossils buried deep beneath the layers of time. When the great dinosaurs faded into silence, the earth did not stay empty for long. In the shadows of a ruined world, new survivors began to stir. They were not giants. They were not creatures of thunder or spectacle. They were small, furry, and easily overlooked. Yet in their tiny bodies lay the seeds of the next great chapter of life. The mammals. These early mammals were not impressive to look at. Many were no larger than mice, their sharp noses twitching as they scurried through the undergrowth of a broken landscape. Others were closer in size to rabbits, with long tails and quick movements that helped them slip away from danger. Unlike the dinosaurs, they did not rule with size or strength. They ruled with flexibility. Where the giants had needed vast forests and endless herds to survive, the mammals needed very little. They could live in narrow cracks, in burrows, in places so small and hidden that nothing else could reach them. One of their greatest strengths was their diet. These creatures were omnivores, eating both plants and animals, which gave them options when the world grew harsh. They gnawed on seeds that had been buried deep enough to escape the acid rains. They nibbled on roots that clung stubbornly to life in the soil. They cracked open beetles and worms, feeding on whatever scurried across the forest floor. When carrion was all that remained, they fed on the scraps of decay. Their stomachs were as adaptable as their bodies, and this made them survivors in a way that no dinosaur had ever been. They lived fast and bred often. A single female could produce many young in a short time, and those young matured quickly, ready to breed themselves within months. In a world where death lingered at every corner, this speed of reproduction gave mammals an edge. Even if predators, starvation, or the cold wiped out some of their kind, new generations were always ready to replace them. Life could not be stamped out completely because it multiplied too quickly to vanish. Their bodies carried another secret weapon: warmth from within. Mammals generated their own heat, unlike reptiles who relied on the Sunday. This ability meant that even in the long, cold nights after the asteroid, they could keep moving while others slowed into stillness. Their fur gave them insulation, holding on to body heat in the freezing air. They were not comfortable, but they could endure, and endurance was all that mattered in a world stripped of comfort. With every passing year, these small creatures began to push into spaces left behind by the vanished giants. Where once herds of hadrosaurs had grazed, small mammals darted through ferns. Where tyrannosaurs had hunted, sharp-toothed insect-eating mammals scurried in the shadows. In the oceans, reptiles had died out, but on land, mammals were slowly taking their place as the restless survivors. They did not yet dominate, but they were laying claim to niches left wide open. As the forests slowly tried to regrow, mammals followed. Some adapted to climbing trees in search of food. Others learned to burrow deeper, digging elaborate tunnel systems that sheltered them from harsh climates. Still others began to explore water edges, testing new habitats where competition was thin. They were experimenters in survival, constantly adjusting, constantly pushing into new possibilities. It was in these humble beginnings that the future of Earth's life was shaped. These rodent-like survivors had no way of knowing it, but they were the ancestors of lions and whales, of elephants and primates, of humans who would one day tell their story. Each quick scurry through the ash, each gnawed seed or cracked beetle shell was part of a chain of survival that stretched into the future. The dawn of the mammals did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It arrived quietly, with tiny feet pattering through the ruins of a fallen world, with soft fur pressed close in underground burrows, with teeth gnashing through scraps of food. In their smallness, they found strength. In their adaptability, they found hope. And in the silence left by the dinosaurs, their voices began to rise, faint at first, but destined to grow louder with every passing age. While mammals scurried through the soil and shadows, another group of survivors was finding its place in the broken world above. The skies, though dimmed and heavy with ash, were not completely empty. Among the rubble of fallen forests and the silence of vanished giants, the descendants of small feathered dinosaurs were stirring. They were fragile in appearance, light-boned and delicate, yet they carried within them one of the greatest tools for survival, the ability to fly. Birds had already existed before the asteroid struck, sharing the world with their massive dinosaur relatives. They were small compared to the thunder lizards, but their lightness was not weakness. It was freedom. They could move swiftly from one place to another, escape dangers more easily, and find food where others could not. When the catastrophe struck, that gift of flight became their lifeline. Their feathers, which had once been used for warmth and display, became critical for survival in the freezing darkness. Feathers trapped body heat, keeping them warm even when icy winds swept across the land. The insulating layers protected fragile bodies from the bitter cold in ways that scales could not. Unlike the larger reptiles that had to rely on sunlight to warm themselves, birds carried their warmth within, shielded by a coat of intricate plumage. Mobility gave them another edge. In a world where food was scarce, being able to travel meant survival. A bird could cover miles in search of seeds, insects, or carrion, while larger animals starved in one place. They could move from one devastated region to another, probing the land for patches of greenery or the faint stirrings of life returning. Where mammals dug inward to hide, birds looked outward, expanding their reach and exploring every crack in the scarred world above. It was not only survival that set them apart. Birds began to adapt and evolve rapidly, seizing opportunities in a planet that had been stripped of its rulers. With the dinosaurs gone, ecological niches lay empty. Some birds specialized in eating seeds, breaking open the hard shells of those that had survived underground. Others honed their ability to hunt insects, darting through ash and debris to catch fleeting meals. A few began to scavenge, picking at the remains of creatures that could not endure. This ability to diversify, to specialize in many small ways, helped birds spread into new environments more quickly than almost any other survivors. Imagine a darkened forest where most trees stand lifeless, their branches black and barren. Amid the silence, the flapping of wings breaks the stillness. Small birds flutter through the air, landing on fallen logs, searching through the bark for worms. Their calls echo faintly, soft but defiant, proof that life has not surrendered. Each flight is an act of persistence, each note of song a whisper of resilience. The world that had once echoed with the stomps and roars of great dinosaurs was now carried by lighter sounds, the beating of wings, the rustle of feathers, the chirp of survival. In their small forms lived the legacy of the giants. Birds were not separate from dinosaurs. They were their living descendants, carrying forward traits of agility, sharp senses, and adaptability. The age of thunder had ended, but its embers still glowed in these creatures who took to the skies. As years passed, birds became more varied, more daring in their attempts to fill the emptiness left behind. Some grew larger, hunting small mammals and reptiles. Others remained tiny, blending into bushes and feeding on seeds. They spread across rivers, coasts, and forests, carving out new roles in a world still struggling to recover. The very skies that had darkened with ash now became their pathway, their chance to rise above the devastation. From the ashes of destruction, life found wings. These survivors did not simply endure, they soared. Their ancestors had walked alongside the giants, but their own future lay in the air, in the endless possibility of flight. And as they rose into the dim skies, they carried with them the promise that even after Earth's darkest days, there was still room for song, for movement, and for life that refused to be silenced. For a long time, the earth was gray and lifeless, a canvas of ash and silence. Forests had burned, meadows had shriveled, and the very soil had been stripped of its richness. Yet even in this desolation, the first whispers of recovery began to stir. They came not in towering trees or colorful blooms, but in the quiet green of ferns. Ferns had lived through countless ages before the dinosaurs, and they were prepared to endure again. Their spores were light, carried easily by wind, able to settle into the tiniest cracks where soil and moisture still lingered. When the skies finally cleared enough for sunlight to return, these spores awoke. Little by little, they spread across the blackened land, dotting it with small green fronds that reached upward. To see a fern grow in a wasteland was to see life's refusal to surrender. These humble plants became the first pioneers of recovery, softening the scars of fire and ash with fragile new growth. As ferns spread, they created a foundation for other plants to follow. Their presence stabilized the soil, preventing it from washing away in rains. Their fallen leaves began to return nutrients to the ground. Slowly, this created pockets of fertility where more ambitious plants could take root. In the shadows of fallen giants, in the quiet spaces between rock and ruin, early forests began to form again. At first, the forests were sparse and uneven, little more than clusters of green breaking through the ash. But with every season, they grew thicker. Young shoots pushed upward, seeking light. Small shrubs branched out, their roots gripping the soil with determination. Trees that had been reduced to charred stumps sent up new growth, reclaiming their place in the canopy. It was not the grand forests of the age of dinosaurs, not yet, but it was a beginning. Seed-bearing plants showed a resilience that was crucial in this fragile stage. Unlike ferns, they carried within them a tiny reserve of stored energy, allowing them to germinate even in poor conditions. Seeds that had been buried deep enough to escape the worst of the acid rains now cracked open, releasing shoots into the open air. Each seed was like a time capsule, holding within it not only the memory of the world that had been, but also the possibility of what the world might become. Grasses and flowering plants began to take advantage of these new conditions, slowly weaving themselves into the recovering landscape. Wherever plants returned, animals followed. Insects crawled back into the greenery, feeding on leaves and flowers. Birds, searching for seeds, fluttered through these patches of new life. Small mammals explored the underbrush, finding shelter and food in the recovering vegetation. Every new fern, every sprouting tree was not just a plant reclaiming the earth, but a spark that reignited the web of life. The transformation was not quick. It took years, even centuries, for landscapes to shift from barren wastelands into living ecosystems again. But nature does not need haste. Each season added another layer of resilience. Each generation of plants returned the soil to richness, layering nutrients from their fallen remains, creating ground capable of sustaining more life. From small beginnings grew complexity, and from complexity grew stability. The sight of green slowly spreading across the earth must have been a profound change after so much darkness. Valleys that had once been lined with ash now filled with soft ferns. Hillsides that had seemed lifeless began to shimmer with grasses. Riversides, once stripped bare, grew curtains of young trees bending toward the light. The return of plants was more than recovery. It was a reweaving of the fabric of life, stitching together a torn planet. The resilience of plants ensured that Earth's story did not end in silence. In their quiet growth, they prepared the way for the resurgence of animals, for the return of forests, and for the dawn of entirely new ecosystems. What had been burned and poisoned became fertile again, step by step, root by root, leaf by leaf. While green slowly returned to the land, the oceans too began their long path back from silence. At first, they were places of emptiness, their waters stripped of the invisible life that once fueled them. When the skies had darkened after the impact, sunlight could no longer reach the shallow seas, and the plankton that formed the base of marine life had collapsed. Without plankton, entire food webs had unraveled, leaving the water eerily still. But as the ash and sulfur slowly settled from the sky, and light once again filtered down through the waves, the first stirrings of recovery began to shimmer in the depths. Tiny plankton cells, resilient and patient, began to multiply. They floated in great drifting clouds, capturing sunlight and turning it into energy, once again feeding the ocean from the bottom up. Where there had been silence, the faint rhythm of life returned. These microscopic organisms were fragile, yet their presence marked the rekindling of the sea's heartbeat. Small fish darted through the water to feed on them, and soon larger creatures followed, slowly building the steps of the food chain again. Even with this recovery, the scars of the disaster were deep. Coral reefs, which had once been bustling underwater cities filled with color and sound, had been devastated. The heat, acid rains, and loss of plankton had reduced them to skeletons, empty structures bleached and broken. For a long time, the reefs stood lifeless, monuments to the richness that had been lost. Their revival would not come quickly. Coral is slow to grow, sometimes only a few millimeters each year, and so their return would take not decades but thousands of years. Yet even in their brokenness, the reefs offered hiding places for fish, crustaceans, and mollusks that sought shelter. In time, Tiny coral polyps began to settle on the ruins, laying the foundation for reefs to rise again, though their full splendor would not return until long after the memory of the catastrophe had faded. The survivors of the seas adapted to this new world in their own ways. Sharks, ancient hunters that had swum through oceans since long before the age of dinosaurs, endured by changing their diets and hunting patterns. They were not bound to a single prey, but took advantage of whatever life the waters still offered. Their resilience carried them forward, making them some of the few large predators to withstand the extinction. Fish, too, showed remarkable adaptability. Some shifted their feeding habits, turning to plankton as it returned. Others thrived in the relative emptiness, free of the marine reptiles that had once dominated the seas. With mosasaurs and plesiosaurs gone, entire niches stood open, waiting to be filled. Over time, fish began to expand into these spaces, their numbers and varieties increasing with each passing generation. From these early survivors would come the explosion of new forms that would one day populate every corner of the ocean, from coral reefs to the darkest depths. The healing of the oceans was slow, but it was steady. Each new pulse of plankton, each sprouting coral, each school of fish darting through the waves was part of a larger cycle of renewal. The seas that had once been graveyards slowly became nurseries again. The currents carried not just the memory of what was lost, but also the promise of what was to come. Above, the winds still shifted the ash of the past, and on land, ferns and forests were reclaiming their ground. Below, the oceans mirrored that persistence, layer by layer, wave by wave, as life tested its strength against the ruins and began to grow once more. 10,000 years may seem like a long time, but for the earth, it is little more than the blink of an eye. Yet in that span, the world that had been shattered by fire, cold, and silence began to find a fragile stability. The scars of the impact were still etched deep into the land, the sea, and the sky, but slowly the planet had shifted from chaos into balance once again. The great crater at Chicxulub, once a raw wound punched into the crust of the earth, had softened with time. Sediments filled its edges, rivers carved their paths around its rim, and the ocean quietly lapped into its basin. It remained a mark of violence, but one partly hidden now beneath layers of stone and water. Across the continents, landscapes once blackened by fire had grown patches of green. Valleys that had echoed with silence were now dotted with ferns, grasses, and young forests. The return of plants had drawn back insects, birds, and mammals, so that life, though different, once again filled the spaces that had been empty. The climate, too, had changed. After years of darkness and cold volcanic eruptions in places like the Deccan Traps continued to pour carbon dioxide into the air. Over thousands of years, these gases built up, trapping heat within the atmosphere. The Earth, once frozen beneath ash, now began to warm. This greenhouse effect reshaped the planet yet again. Ice retreated. Rain fell more often in some regions and less in others. Deserts shifted, rivers swelled, and coastlines redrew themselves. The world that emerged was not the same as the one that the dinosaurs had ruled. It was a new version of Earth, reshaped by catastrophe, reshaped by time. This warming climate offered opportunities as well as challenges. Where once only scattered survivors clung to life, now ecosystems began to grow complex again. Forests thickened, carrying canopies of leaves that shaded the ground and fed the air with oxygen. Grasslands opened in places where trees could not spread, creating new habitats for small mammals to scurry and for birds to hunt. Wetlands returned, filling with reeds and frogs. Each habitat was a stage, and on each stage, evolution began to experiment again. With the giants gone, new evolutionary paths appeared, and life moved quickly to explore them. Mammals that had once been no larger than mice began to grow. Some became better diggers, carving homes in the soil. Others grew sharper teeth, learning to hunt. A few stretched into the trees, gripping branches with nimble paws. Each generation carried small changes, and over thousands of years, those changes shaped entirely new creatures. The absence of towering dinosaurs meant that mammals could expand in ways that had once been impossible. They were no longer confined to the shadows. Birds, too, began to diversify. Their wings carried them into every corner of the world, from coastal cliffs to inland forests. Some developed longer beaks to feed on flowers and seeds. Others grew sharp talons to hunt the mammals that now darted through the grass. In their flight, they connected the ecosystems, spreading seeds, carrying life from one patch of forest to another, weaving together the threads of recovery. The oceans also reflected this rebirth. With plankton restored and reefs slowly beginning to regrow, fish multiplied in numbers. Sharks remained strong hunters, while new species of bony fish began to fill the seas with variety. The vast emptiness of the post-impact oceans was being replaced by a patchwork of thriving communities once again. Still, the earth bore its scars. Fossil beds marked the sudden end of entire lineages. Ash layers told of skies once blackened. Rock formations captured the chemical changes of poisoned seas. Every cliff and canyon held pieces of the memory of that day. The world had not forgotten, even as it grew new life upon those wounds. 10,000 years after the impact, the earth stood as both grave and nursery. It carried the bones of what had been, while nurturing the first outlines of what was to come. Evolution had begun to sketch new designs upon the canvas left by extinction, reshaping the future with every passing season. The footsteps of dinosaurs no longer shook the ground, but in their absence, countless smaller voices rose, filling the air, the land, and the seas with a new chorus of life. The world after the asteroid had been shaped by emptiness. For years, life had struggled under skies without light and across lands stripped of food. The seas had thinned, the forests had vanished, and the great herds had disappeared forever. Yet as the planet slowly warmed and green returned to valleys and plains, that emptiness transformed into something else. What had once been scarcity began to open into opportunity. In the age of dinosaurs, the world had been crowded with giants. Towering sauropods had swept through forests, devouring trees by the ton. Horned and armored beasts had dominated the plains, while predators like tyrannosaurs ruled the hunt. Their presence had left little room for anything else to grow. Smaller animals lived in the shadows, hiding in cracks and burrows, taking what little scraps the giants left behind. But with those rulers gone, an entire planet had suddenly opened. For the first time in over 160 million years, niches once occupied by enormous reptiles stood empty. There were no long-necked giants to strip the trees bare, no heavy-footed herds to crowd the plains, no towering predators to keep the shadows filled with danger. Into this vacuum stepped the survivors, and chief among them were the mammals. Mammals had once been small, rarely larger than a rat or rabbit, creatures that survived by staying unnoticed. But now they began to grow bolder. They ventured out of the shadows, exploring spaces they had never dared to enter. Some species became larger, testing what it meant to feed on more abundant plants. Others became sharper hunters, filling the roles once held by the great carnivores. Their flexibility was their strength, and in this world of sudden vacancy, they adapted quickly. Every ecosystem began to diversify again, Where once there had been a handful of survivors clinging to roots and scraps, now there was the beginning of variety. Forests filled with small scurrying mammals, birds darting between branches, insects buzzing through the undergrowth. Rivers carried fish and amphibians, and wetlands pulsed with frogs and turtles. Grasslands formed across the cooling plains, attracting grazers that were no longer reptiles, but early mammals, chewing through shoots and seeds. With each new plant that grew, each animal that adapted, the chains of life grew longer, stronger, and more complex. This was not a sudden transformation, but a slow and steady reshaping. It took generations upon generations for these creatures to spread, to change, to carve out roles in the recovering earth. Yet every small step added to the momentum. A rodent that learned to crack hard seeds gave rise to new feeding strategies. A predator that grew larger to chase mammals set the stage for bigger hunters. A bird that developed a stronger beak opened the way for the rise of new forms of songbirds. Evolution was moving quickly now, faster than it had when dinosaurs filled the earth, because the competition was gone and every empty space was an invitation. It is hard to imagine the silence that once followed the asteroid, a silence broken only by wind and water. But 10,000 years later, that quiet was filling with voices again. The chirps of birds, the rustle of mammals in the grass, the splash of fish in rivers. What had been absence was turning into abundance. Life, which had been pushed to its very edge, was reclaiming its strength. And in this new world of opportunities, the stage was being set for something even greater. Mammals, once overlooked and fragile, were not only surviving, they were thriving. They were beginning a journey that would one day lead to lions and whales, to elephants and wolves, to primates, and eventually to us. But in those early days, it was simply about filling the emptiness, step by step, until the earth was alive with diversity again. As life began to fill the empty spaces left behind by the dinosaurs, balance slowly returned to the earth, with plants regaining their hold on the soil and herbivores venturing out to graze. A new need arose. Wherever there are animals that feed, there must also be those that hunt. For millions of years, predators had been the giants of the world, with teeth like swords and claws that could tear through bone. Their absence after the asteroid left a strange quiet in the food chain. But silence never lasts long in nature, and in time, new hunters began to rise. Among the mammals, change came quickly. Once, tiny creatures that hid beneath roots and in burrows, some now grew larger with each passing generation. They developed stronger jaws, sharper teeth, and more powerful limbs. Their bodies adapted for pursuit, for ambush, for the relentless chase of prey. Some became pack hunters, their survival tied not only to strength, but also to cooperation. Others relied on stealth, learning to strike swiftly from the shadows. These were not yet the great predators of today, but they were the beginning of a lineage that would one day give rise to wolves, big cats, and bears. For the first time, mammals were not only prey, they were also predators. Birds, too, began to change. With the skies cleared of the great pterosaurs that had once ruled above, they expanded into every aerial niche. Some remained small, feeding on seeds and insects, but others grew sharp talons and hooked beaks. They became hunters of the skies, swooping down to seize small mammals or fish from rivers. Raptors, the ancestors of hawks and eagles, began their long ascent as the new lords of the air. Their wings gave them an advantage, carrying them over vast landscapes in search of prey, their keen eyes spotting the slightest movement below. In a world where survival depended on adaptability, their speed and flight gave them mastery of the skies. The return of predators reshaped ecosystems everywhere. Herbivores could no longer graze without caution. The rustle of grass might signal danger, the shadow overhead might mean death. This tension forced prey to adapt as well. Some grew faster, others became more watchful. Many developed behaviors that increased their chances of survival, from living in groups to breeding quickly. Predator and prey danced together in a cycle as old as life itself, each shaping the other with every new generation. With time, apex predators emerged once more. They were not the colossal tyrannosaurs or the towering marine reptiles of old, but they were every bit as vital to the balance of nature. Apex predators filled the highest roles in the food chain, keeping populations of herbivores in check, ensuring that no single species consumed too much, and allowing ecosystems to remain in balance. Their presence gave structure to the fragile new world, reintroducing the rhythm of hunt and survival that had been missing since the giants fell. It is striking to imagine how quiet the earth must have felt in those first years after the asteroid, when herds wandered without fear of pursuit. That emptiness did not last. Once mammals learned to hunt, and birds sharpened their talons, the landscapes were alive with tension again. Every forest clearing, every stretch of grassland, every winding river became a stage where survival was contested daily. The drama of predator and prey, silenced by catastrophe, returned to shape the future of life. And so, out of the ashes of extinction, a new balance emerged. Mammals had claimed the role of hunters on the ground. Birds had taken the skies. Together, they restored one of the most fundamental dynamics of the living world. From this moment onward, evolution would never again be quiet. When we look back on the extinction that ended the reign of the dinosaurs, one truth becomes clear. It was not strength, or size, or even dominance that guaranteed survival. The very traits that had made dinosaurs kings of the earth for over 160 million years became the same traits that sealed their fate when disaster struck. The giants were too big, too dependent on an abundance of food, and too specialized to bend when the world suddenly broke beneath them. The small, overlooked creatures, the ones that lived in burrows and shadows, carried the key to endurance. They did not need vast forests to sustain them, only seeds, roots, or scraps hidden beneath the soil. They did not need to roam across wide plains. They could survive in a single patch of ground. Their bodies could endure hunger longer, their lifespans were shorter, and they reproduced more quickly, giving them more chances to pass on useful traits. In the chaos after the asteroid, those small advantages made all the difference. The lesson written into that ancient scar is one of adaptability. Dinosaurs had thrived in a world that was stable enough to support their immense bodies, but when that stability shattered, they could not adjust fast enough. Mammals, birds, insects, and even amphibians survived, not because they were more powerful, but because they were more flexible. They could change their diets, they could hide, they could endure lean years by needing less. In a world that had become unpredictable, adaptability was the true strength. Specialization, once a gift, became a trap. Many dinosaurs had evolved into precise forms, perfectly suited for their environments. Some were built to graze on certain plants, others to hunt specific prey. When those plants vanished or those prey animals died, the specialists had nothing left to fall back on. Mammals, however, were generalists. They could eat plants, insects, roots, or meat, depending on what was available. That lack of refinement gave them resilience, a kind of insurance policy against a collapsing world. And yet, survival was not only about traits or habits, it was also about chance. The asteroid's impact was a random strike, a cosmic accident that no creature could have prepared for. Many species that might have thrived later were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in firestorms, crushed by tsunamis, or poisoned by ash. Survival was not a guarantee for any group, no matter how well adapted. It was a fragile chain of luck, timing, and circumstance. Some mammals survived because their burrows happened to be deep enough. Some birds survived because their ancestors had already evolved the ability to live on seeds that could be stored and eaten when plants were gone. Crocodiles endured because they could slip into rivers and wait out the famine with slow metabolisms. Each story of survival is a reminder of how delicate the balance was. A few degrees colder, a few years darker, and even they might have vanished. What emerges from this story is not just the triumph of life, but its fragility. The world that was once filled with thunder-footed giants was silenced almost overnight, and the future of all life rested in the paws of tiny mammals, in the wings of small birds, in the shells of reptiles hiding in mud. From those faint flickers of endurance, every creature that exists today can trace its lineage. The lessons from that survival echo forward into the present. Size may dazzle, strength may dominate, but adaptability is what carries life through upheaval, and woven through it all is chance, that unpredictable thread that can turn rulers into fossils and the forgotten into ancestors. The earth does not promise survival to the mighty, it offers it to the flexible, the persistent, and sometimes simply the lucky. For centuries after the asteroid struck, the world had been defined by silence and scarcity. Charred landscapes stretched for miles, stripped bare of trees, their blackened trunks standing like broken monuments to the forests that once covered the earth. Ash had blanketed the soil, and acid rain had washed away nutrients, leaving only the hardiest of plants to cling to life. But time, as always, brought change. The earth had endured fire and ice, and slowly it began to heal. What had been wasteland started to stir with color again. The first to return were the ferns. They were nature's pioneers, hardy and unyielding, spreading across open ground where other plants could not yet take hold. Their spores drifted on the wind, settling into cracks and crevices, sprouting into green carpets that softened the scorched land. For years, ferns dominated the planet, a sign that life had not only survived, but was beginning to reclaim its home. Yet even as they spread, evolution was preparing something greater. Flowering plants, which had existed quietly in the age of dinosaurs, now began to rise to prominence. They had survived the impact tucked away in pockets of soil and seed, and in the centuries after, they seized their chance to flourish. Unlike ferns, flowering plants offered nectar, fruits, and seeds, rich in energy and nutrition. Their blooms added splashes of color to a world that had once been gray and barren. Reds, yellows, and purples dotted the recovering landscapes, drawing attention in a way that the forests of the past never had. These flowers were not only beautiful but strategic. They lured insects with sweetness, ensuring their pollen would be carried far and wide. In return, insects found new sources of food, forging a partnership that would shape the future of ecosystems forever. Insects, too, were evolving alongside this rebirth. Bees, butterflies, and beetles began to specialize, drawn to the colors and scents of flowers. Their bodies adapted to carry pollen grains, making them not just consumers of nectar, but unwitting gardeners of the world. With every landing and every flight, they spread life further. This coevolution bound plants and insects together, each depending on the other for survival. Forests thickened not just because plants grew taller, but because the air itself buzzed with life that carried their seeds and pollen to new soil. Trees returned next, slowly but steadily. Saplings that had once struggled in the thin light began to climb toward the Sunday leaves unfurled, casting shade onto the ground, shaping new layers of habitat. Within centuries, vast forests stretched across valleys and plains again, lush and green. They were not the same forests that the dinosaurs had known. These were younger, faster growing, filled with flowering trees and fruit-bearing plants that supported a far greater variety of creatures. The forests no longer belonged to giants. Instead, they sheltered mammals, birds, and insects, weaving together the fabric of new ecosystems. The regrowth of forests also transformed the climate. Trees breathed carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, balancing the atmosphere and cooling the warming world. Roots dug deep into soil, holding it firm against rain and wind, preventing erosion and enriching the ground for other plants. Rivers ran clearer, shaded by canopies that cooled the water and made it safe for fish and amphibians. Forests became not only homes for animals, but regulators of life itself, stabilizing the planet after so many centuries of instability. The return of lush ecosystems brought with it endless opportunities for evolution. Mammals found fruit to eat and branches to climb. Birds filled the treetops with song, nesting high above the ground. Insects multiplied in staggering numbers, feeding not only on plants, but also on one another, creating complex webs of interaction. Every leaf, every flower, every buzzing wing was part of the slow rebuilding of balance. And as the forest spread, so too did diversity. Where once the earth had been uniform in its destruction, now it blossomed with variety. Wet forests thick with vines grew along rivers. Grasslands opened at the edges of canopies. Dry woodlands took root in places where rain was scarce. Each new biome supported its own cast of life, each connected to the greater story of renewal. What had been a planet of ash and silence was now alive with green, with color, and with sound. The forests were not simply returning, they were reinventing the world, creating the foundation for everything that would follow. And as the canopies thickened and shadows deepened, the stage was set for even greater changes that would ripple through every corner of life. The Earth that emerged from the asteroid's shadow was not the same planet it had been before. The impact had scarred it deeply, leaving craters, ash, and broken landscapes stretching across continents. Yet, in time, destruction itself became the foundation for renewal. Out of fire and ruin, the earth slowly rebuilt itself, layer by layer, in ways both visible and hidden. The first changes began with the ground beneath the feet of survivors. When forests burned and animals perished, their remains did not vanish into nothing. Ash settled onto the soil in heavy blankets, mixing with charred wood and bone. Over years and centuries, these fragments decayed, turning into a new, dark layer rich in nutrients. It was harsh at first, poisoned by chemicals and acids, but nature has always known how to transform death into life. Microbes in the soil broke down what was left behind, recycling it into the building blocks of growth. From this mixture of ash and decay, fertile soils began to form. Out of that soil, the seeds of ferns, flowering plants, and trees found a way to sprout again. Even the oceans carried signs of rebuilding. Sediment rained down through the water, mixing with dust from the skies and the shells of tiny plankton that had managed to survive. Layer upon layer of fine particles drifted to the seafloor, quietly recording the slow recovery. These new layers of sediment became part of the rock record, sealing in the memory of catastrophe and renewal side by side. In cliffs, in riverbeds, and in deep cores pulled from ocean floors, that thin band of ash can still be seen today, a line that divides the world of the dinosaurs from the world that followed. That boundary is known to science as the KPG boundary, a razor-thin line rich in iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in asteroids. It is the fingerprint of the very rock that ended the age of giants. To the eye, it looks like nothing more than a narrow band of clay or dark stone, yet within that strip lies the story of how life was destroyed and how it began again. Above the line are fossils of creatures that never returned, ammonites, giant reptiles, dinosaurs. Below it, an ancient world that once thrived, and above it, the first hints of a new beginning. Over millions of years, the Earth layered these memories one atop the other. Volcanic flows hardened into rock, rivers carved through plains and left behind sand and gravel. Ancient seas retreated and returned, pressing shells and coral into limestone. Each change added another page to the Earth's diary, capturing both catastrophe and recovery. To walk across the land today is to walk on those layers of history, each step resting on the ruins of worlds long past. Scientists, piecing this record together, have learned to read those silent pages. They drill into deep cores, slicing through stone that has not seen light for tens of millions of years. They study the fossils that appear above and below that dark band, noting where species vanish and where new forms begin to rise. They measure isotopes, tiny chemical clues that reveal how temperatures fell, how the air thinned, and how the oceans turned acidic before healing. From these fragments, they reconstruct the story not just of extinction, but of resilience. The rock record does not speak with words, yet it tells a story clearer than any written history. It shows us the ash that blanketed the earth, the soot from global fires, the sudden loss of diversity, and the gradual climb back toward life. In every layer, there is evidence of struggle, of adaptation, of return. Each fossilized seed, each tiny mammal tooth, each preserved feather is a whisper of survival. In time, these layers became the foundation of the world we know. The soils born from decay grew forests that fed new animals. The sediments at the bottom of oceans became stone that would one day rise as mountains. Even the thin band of iridium, silent and still, became a marker of life's most dramatic turning point. The Earth, wounded but unbroken, had written its own record of destruction and renewal, and from those silent pages, the future continued to unfold. When the asteroid struck and the dinosaurs fell, it was more than just the end of an age. It was a fork in the road of history, a turning point so absolute that the entire course of life on Earth was redirected. Without that impact, without the fires, the darkness, and the collapse of the giants, mammals would have remained in the shadows. The world would still have been ruled by towering reptiles, and creatures like us might never have existed at all. Before the impact, mammals were small and timid, tucked away in burrows and hidden in the corners of forests. They were not the rulers of their world, but the survivors beneath it. For millions of years they had lived in the shadow of dinosaurs, never able to rise higher because the ecosystems were already full, every niche occupied by something larger and stronger. The asteroid shattered that order in a single moment, sweeping away the dominance of the giants and leaving behind empty spaces in the web of life. Those spaces became opportunities, and mammals were ready to take them. The disappearance of the dinosaurs did not just create absence, it created possibility. Where vast herds of plant-eating dinosaurs once grazed, small mammals began to expand into open land, adapting to eat seeds, roots, and eventually fruits as plants returned. Where fierce predators like tyrannosaurs had once hunted, mammals grew larger, learning to chase and kill. In rivers and forests, in plains and mountains, creatures that had once only scurried now began to climb, run, swim, and leap into new forms of life. This turning point was not gentle. it was born out of struggle. For every species that survived, countless others still perished in the years that followed. But the few that endured found themselves in a world where they could finally flourish. They bred quickly, they adapted rapidly, and within thousands of years, they began to take on shapes that would echo forward through time. Some grew into the ancestors of wolves, lions, and bears. Others became the forerunners of deer and horses, and in the smallest of them, those that learned to use their hands and sharpen their senses, the faint path toward humanity had already begun. The extinction was both a tragedy and a beginning. It destroyed a world of unimaginable grandeur, yet it also planted the seeds of the world we now know. Without it, there might never have been the rise of mammals, no birds filling the skies in such variety, no great forests filled with flowering plants, and no humans standing to wonder about it all. The very fact that we are here, able to look back and tell this story, is a direct result of that catastrophe. We are not separate from the extinction, we are born of it. And so the asteroid, in all its violence, reminds us of a truth as old as life itself. Endings are not always final. In nature, every ending carries within it the possibility of a beginning. The fall of the dinosaurs cleared the way for mammals. The silence that followed was filled again with song, movement, and growth. The scar left behind by the impact became not just a mark of destruction, but a foundation upon which new life could rise. That is the paradox of the Great Extinction. It was the end of giants, yet the beginning of us. It silenced one world but made room for another to speak. From fire and ash came renewal. From darkness came opportunity. And from loss came the fragile, uncertain chance for life to continue its story in a new direction. 66 million years have passed since the day the asteroid struck, yet the Earth still carries the memory of that moment. The story of the dinosaurs' end and the rebirth of life is not told in words, but in stone. To uncover it, scientists look to the ground beneath our feet, to the rocks, fossils, and invisible chemical traces that quietly preserve a history no human eye ever saw. With every layer of earth, with every fossil bone or ancient seed, a clearer picture of the past emerges. At the very heart of this story lies the KPG boundary, a thin line of clay pressed into rock layers across the entire planet. This boundary is only a few centimeters thick, yet it is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in science. Beneath it, the world of the dinosaurs stretches in abundance. Bones of hadrosaurs, ammonites spiraled in stone, forests turned to coal. Above it, a very different world begins to appear, mammals rising, flowering plants spreading, and many familiar creatures gone forever. The line itself is rich in iridium, a metal rare on Earth but common in asteroids. Its presence was the smoking gun, the proof that the end of the dinosaurs was not caused by slow decline alone, but by an extraterrestrial visitor that struck with unimaginable force. For decades, scientists debated what ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Some thought volcanoes alone were to blame, others believed climate change or disease had chipped away at them. But the iridium layer, first discovered in the late 20th century, settled the argument with a silent clarity. This rare element, spread like dust across the globe, could only have come from a massive impact. And so, the thin clay band at the KPG boundary became a marker of catastrophe, a signature of the asteroid that reshaped life forever. Yet the rocks reveal more than just destruction. Fossils found near the boundary offer glimpses of survival, of the fragile chain that allowed life to continue. In North Dakota, at a site known as Tanis, paleontologists uncovered fish fossils with tiny glass beads lodged in their gills, ejected from the impact blast itself. The discovery showed how sudden and violent the event truly was. Elsewhere, burrows preserved in stone tell of mammals that tunneled into the ground and endured the fire and cold above. Seeds fossilized in soil record how plants clung on in the poisoned earth, waiting for sunlight to return. Every find is like a fragment of a forgotten diary, capturing not just the end, but the struggle to endure. Modern science adds new ways of reading these stories. CT scans allow researchers to peer inside fossils without breaking them open, revealing delicate structures like the inner ear bones of mammals or the air sacs of early birds. These details show how creatures adapted, how sharper hearing or stronger lungs helped them survive the darkened world. Isotopes, the chemical signatures locked in teeth and shells, reveal what these animals ate and drank in the months after the impact. By studying oxygen and carbon isotopes, scientists can see when waters turned acidic or when plants stopped growing, and how survivors shifted their diets in desperation. Computer modeling takes all these clues and brings the ancient catastrophe to life. By feeding data into simulations, researchers can recreate the asteroid's impact, the waves that swept across oceans, the global fires that raged, and the years of cold that followed. These models help explain how so many species vanished, while others, small and adaptable, managed to cling on. The past is no longer a distant and silent mystery. It becomes a living story, told through technology and imagination, anchored in evidence. Every fossil at the boundary, every speck of iridium, every scan and chemical trace is part of this grand puzzle. Together, they allow us to see how chance, adaptation, and resilience shaped the survival of life. The Earth story is written in stone, and through the patience of science, that stone now speaks. The end of the dinosaurs was not just a story sealed in stone. Its echoes reach all the way into the present, shaping every tree, bird, and mammal that exists today, including us. The asteroid impact was both a tragedy and a beginning, a moment when life was nearly erased, but also reborn in new and surprising ways. What survived then became the foundation of everything that surrounds us now. Modern biodiversity is rooted in that survival. Every bird that takes flight today carries the legacy of the dinosaurs that endured. They are not just distant relatives, they are living reminders that not all giants vanished, that some found a way to adapt and change into smaller, quicker, feathered forms. Their songs at dawn, their migrations across continents, their endless variety of shapes and colors, all trace back to those fragile survivors of the great catastrophe. Mammals, too, rose because of that turning point. Those early burrowers, once overlooked, multiplied, and spread into roles left vacant by the fallen dinosaurs. In time, they grew into great beasts like mammoths and saber-toothed cats, into agile hunters like wolves and lions, and into countless other forms that filled forests, plains, and seas. From them, eventually, came primates, and from primates, humans. Without the asteroid, the story of life would not have unfolded this way. We would not be here to reflect on it at all. The very shape of ecosystems today still bears the mark of the extinction. The balance between predator and prey, the spread of flowering plants, the diversity of insects, the rise of coral reefs, all were guided by the reset that the impact forced upon the planet. If dinosaurs had remained dominant, mammals might never have left the shadows. If plants had not recovered in the ways they did, forests as we know them would not exist. Life as it appears now is a direct continuation of that fragile chain of survival, a sequence of adaptations and chance that began in the darkness after the impact. Yet the story is not only one of the past, the echoes of that extinction also whisper a warning for the present. The asteroid was a natural disaster, sudden and unstoppable, but today the Earth faces another crisis, one of our own making. Scientists speak of a sixth mass extinction, not from fire raining down from the sky, but from human activity. Deforestation, pollution, climate change, and overhunting are unraveling food chains just as surely as the collapse of photosynthesis once did. Species are vanishing at a pace faster than at almost any time since the asteroid impact. The lesson of the dinosaurs is stark. No matter how powerful, no matter how dominant, no species is immune to extinction. The great reptiles that once ruled every corner of the earth were undone in the span of a single day, and the world moved on without them. Humans, too, stand at the mercy of forces larger than ourselves. The choices we make now, how we treat the planet, how we guard or waste its resources, will decide which species survive into the future and which fade into memory. To look at a bird in the sky or a mammal roaming the forests is to see the proof of resilience. Life found a way after the asteroid, but it also reminds us that resilience has limits. Push too far, break too many chains in the web of life, and survival narrows until only the smallest and most adaptable remain. The thin line of iridium in the Earth's crust tells us that the reset has happened before. The question that lingers is whether we are pushing ourselves toward another one. The echoes of that ancient event live not only in stone, but in the choices we face now. The dinosaurs remind us of fragility, but also of opportunity. The Earth will go on, but whether we are part of its next chapter depends on what we do with the lesson they left behind. 66 million years ago, the asteroid fell, and in a heartbeat, the age of the dinosaurs ended. The thunder of giants that had echoed across the land for more than 160 million years was silenced, and the world they had built was shattered. The skies burned, the seas boiled, the forests turned to ash, and 3/4 of all life vanished. It was a moment of destruction so absolute that it seemed as though Earth itself had reached its final breath. And yet, from that silence, from that devastation, life found a way forward. The giants were gone, but their absence opened space for something new. Tiny mammals that once hid in the shadows began to emerge, and birds, the last living branch of the dinosaurs, spread their wings into an open sky. The web of life rewove itself, thread by fragile thread, until it formed the world we know today. We walk on a planet that is, in every sense, a child of catastrophe. We owe our very existence to a chain of survival that began in the ashes of that single day. It is humbling to realize how fragile life truly is. The dinosaurs were not weak. They were not poorly adapted. They were the rulers of their world, stronger and more dominant than anything alive now. And yet, their fate was decided in a single strike from beyond the sky. It reminds us that survival is not about strength alone, but about adaptability. Those that could hide, those that could change, those that could live in places where others could not, carried the story of life forward. The small inherited the earth because they could bend without breaking. And so, we are left with a haunting question. If the dinosaurs had not died, would we even exist? Would mammals have ever risen from the shadows to fill the world with their countless forms? Would forests have grown in the way they did? Would birds have painted the skies with their endless colors? Would humans have appeared to tell this story at all? The asteroid did not just end an age, it carved the path to our own beginning. When we look at the thin line of clay that marks the KPG boundary, that razor's edge in the rocks of the earth, we see more than just a moment of death. We see the place where life reset itself. It is a scar, but it is also a foundation, and in its quiet testimony, it tells us that endings can give birth to beginnings. Today, as we stand in a world full of life, with forests stretching, oceans teeming, and skies filled with wings, it is easy to forget that all of this is borrowed time, shaped by chance and survival. We are the children of catastrophe, and the lesson of the dinosaurs is written into our very existence. Nothing lasts forever, and even the mightiest can fall. What endures is the ability to adapt, to change, and to carry the spark of life forward into whatever future waits. So tonight, as we close this journey through fire and ash, let us hold on to that awe. The dinosaurs may have perished, but through their ending, they gave rise to us. Their story is not only about loss, but about the fragile, miraculous continuity of life. If this quiet journey has brought you wonder, if it has stirred your imagination or softened your thoughts as you drift toward rest, it would mean so much if you gently tapped the like button or even subscribed to join us again. Here, in this little corner of calm, we explore more mysteries of life, death, and survival, always told with science, always told with stillness. And before you go, I would love to know, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? It is always beautiful to see how far this story of survival travels, reaching so many corners of our fragile planet. So now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders rest, and carry with you this thought. The asteroid ended an age, but it opened the way for another. Without that day of fire, we would not be here. Life is fragile, but it is also unbreakable in its will to endure.